This is Grandpa's house. Please leave a message.
Hi, Dad. Dorothy is walking home from school feeling sick. I would really appreciate it if you would go and read her a story because I'm stuck at work. Thank you.
Grandpa!
Your mom tells me you're homesick from school today and you like to hear stories, is that right? Well, how about this one? I know it looks heavy, but it's exciting, I promise. Knowledge overpowered society. Knowledge to the point of too much knowledge, leading to destruction. In fact, the human race had progressed so far that we held the knowledge and the power to destroy ourselves. The nuclear bomb!
Huh?
I see we have to start from the very beginning.
The Enlightenment was a time of immense intellectual growth. Renowned philosophers circulated radical ideas as thinkers tried to reform their society, to improve and renew it. John Locke believed that humans were innately good, that they had a blank mind. He believed in tabula rasa. But society corrupted the people, driving them to evil. Society, impossibly of course, would be better off if there was in fact no society. Yet Locke knew that government and society was inevitable. Thus, the government had an important social contract to protect the rights of the people. Hobbes, however, believed in an entirely contrary theory. He held the view that humans were innately evil and required strict government control to maintain an orderly society. Yet another philosopher, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, believed humans were naturally good, but that owning property corrupted them.
The first man who, having enclosed a piece of ground, bethought himself of saying, "This is mine," and found people simple enough to believe him, was the first real founder of civil society.
Claimed Rousseau.
From how many crimes, wars, and murders, and how many horrors and misfortunes might not anyone have saved mankind by pulling up the stakes, or filling up the ditch, and crying to his fellows, "Beware of listening to this impostor. You are undone if you only forget the fruits of the earth belong to us all, and the earth itself to nobody."
And perhaps, according to Rousseau, this is what eventually causes the catastrophic wars that change history. Thus, the Enlightenment, with the growing spirit of acceptance for radical and conflicting beliefs, represents a drive away from traditional systems and organization. The essence of making it new began to rise.
The Industrial Revolution marked the transition from rural to an urban way of life, a transition which becomes essential to the definition of modernism. The majority of the population lived in small towns working their own farms, producing their own food, and sewing their own clothes. But the agricultural revolution created a surplus of food, creating a population boom. Farmers were forced off of their lands and migrated into cities in search of work. Factories developed in the cities, and industry expanded and accelerated using new technologies invented specifically for the improvement of daily life. This improvement of daily life evolved into a key characteristic of modernism. However, the rise of factories meant everything was soon being mass-produced. Factory techniques emphasized efficiency, the sameness of every hour of every day and of every part of every product became stagnant monotony. No creativity, no experiments, no radicalism. The ideal of efficiency emerged, creating a barrier for the modernists who would soon seek to re-revolutionize the world. The Romantic time period emphasized creativity, imagination, and the arts, varying vastly from the Enlightenment, a time period in which the focus was on explanations of the tangible. Appreciation for nature and natural beauty was heavily emphasized in the Romantic works. Philosophically speaking, during the Romantic era, views shifted from an objective view to a subjective one. Philosopher Immanuel Kant proposed that humans do not see the world directly, but through a number of categories defined by an individual self-essence. We do not see the world as it is, we see it as we are. This is a subjective view of the world. The empirical and objective views of the Enlightenment had left little room for creativity, imagination, or a subjective viewpoint. However, the Romantics emphasized the importance of art and the freedom of the human spirit. This was a rejection of the mechanical view of the world during the Enlightenment and the Industrial Revolution. Perhaps the development of the Romantic era, most relevant through modernism, was a rising self-interest in the self and value of the individual.
World War I, laced with massive destruction, became known as the Great War, and marked perhaps the most significant step in the transition to modernism. Machine guns fired for the first time on the battlefield, and poison gas took lives by the thousands. Trenches flowed with blood, and doubts arose. Perhaps the death of 37 million men did not symbolize a strong society and prosperous nation. Perhaps the new European debt of over $10 billion was destroying the nation's economy. This war to end all wars was looked upon with such ghastly horror that many people simply could not imagine what the world seemed to be plunging towards. It was time for a new era, a new approach, and a new definition of progress towards a new ideal: modernism.
From these revolutionary ideas of ages past, the concept of modernism arose, with the basic guiding principles of rejecting tradition and striving for unpredictable results. A modernist set of values stressed freedom of expression, experimentation, radicalism, and even primitism. Although the modernists pulled a few concepts from various preceding time periods, the unique modern cry to make it new demanded reinterpretation of these prior philosophies. Now let's see what the experts have to say about this.
Instead of the progress and advancement of society, the modernists saw worrisome decay and growing alienation of the individual. The mechanisms at work within their society were perceived by those thinkers as impersonal
and incompatible with the natural artistic impulses of the self. Intellectuals and artists at the turn of the 20th century believed that the previous generation's way of doing things was a cultural dead end. Something fundamental, something big had to change.
The modernist period marks the origins of the distinction between high art, concepts and works of heavy meaning, those that are seen to have deeper cultural relevance, and low art, pop culture, cartoons, and entertainment for the masses. The mindset of modernism emphasizes the return of art forms to their most fundamental characteristics, stripping the basic preconceptions of art until left with nothing but the barest outlines. Abstract artists began with the assumption that color and shape formed the essential characteristics of art, not the depiction of the natural world. Through this type of thought process, the modernists were looking backwards to travel forwards, using concepts from the past and reintroducing them in entirely new ways, applying the most minimal of hints to the old ways to make it new.
The literary developments that took place during the age of modernism were relatively universal across all genres and all locations.
The 20th century played backdrop to a change in the paradigm, first between the sexes, and then later between different cultural units. This shift contributed to the diversification of voices, and therefore views and experiences, which entered the world of literature.
Diversity pushed the modernist ideal of creating works that were innovative and different. The concept of an unreliable narrator superseded the typical omniscient and trustworthy narration, forcing readers to question every last one of their preconceived assumptions about how novels were supposed to function.
In addition, a whole new perspective came into being known as the stream of consciousness. It became common for a character to have drawn-out conversations with himself to enrich the significance of the plot.
Nobody likes you. Not listening. I'm not listening.
You're a liar. And a thief.
No. Murderer.
Unique to American literature, the Lost Generation, a group of writers and thinkers, has come to symbolize modernism. Among the ranks of this assembly were the intellectual Gertrude Stein, novelist Ernest Hemingway and F. Scott Fitzgerald, and painter Waldo Pierce. Their title, Lost Generation, refers to the aftermath of 4 years of warfare and destruction. They saw a world stunted in various areas of thought, lacking sufficient consideration for spirituality and existentialism. The Lost Generation's general objective was to explore these streams of thought so they could rediscover meaning in the world, and they sought to achieve their goal by recording the core workings of consciousness and turning inward to examine the essence of self.
Through much mulling and contemplation by some of the strongest minds of the time, modernist literature developed certain key conventions. There is a curiosity regarding self and inward characteristics, the elimination of traditional structures to face the shock of reality, and an adaptable, unsettled nature to truth and knowledge. The detectable traits that indicate the use of such principles include the rejection of intelligible plots and clear-cut characters, or the establishment of poetry that lend itself to no obvious interpretation.
When examining overall change, one finds that it was the poets who took to the new spirit of the times with the most enthusiasm, as they stretched the possibilities of verse in unpredictable, innovative ways. I love poetry! The French symbolists, for example, were often admired for the sophistication of their imagery. There also arose the idea that poetry must concentrate solely on
the thing itself,
in the words of critic poet T.E. Home.
To achieve this new standard necessitated minimalist language, a slackening in the adherence to traditional structure of poems, and a plain directness that Victorian and Romantic poetry had not even begun to explore. At some points, this frank quality resulted in the blurring of lines between poetry and vernacular. Gone was the ornamental, loquacious style of the Victorian era. Also absent was the fixation on customary definitions of beauty and nature. Potential themes and questions for poets became boundless, resulted in the blurring of lines between poetry and vernacular. Resulted in the blurring of lines.
The Romantic mindset glorified nature and being. This approach was dramatically shifted during modernism, when the focus on inner self and consciousness was introduced as mainstream. The call to make it new made these changes in society more acceptable. Sigmund Freud was a big supporter of this focus, and his theories correlate directly with the direction of society during the time. Freud argued that all subjective reality
is interpreted through a series of reactions based on basic drives and instincts.
This was a radical change in thinking from the past, in which Locke's tabula rasa theory was widespread. The central idea to tabula rasa stated that external forces could not affect the individual, and people were just blank slates in an absolute reality. Freud's breakthrough theory posed a different explanation. This primal impulse to an unconscious mind was an idea that implied John Locke had it backwards.
It's the mind that has absolute perception. It already has a set of instincts that provide a subjective interpretation of the world. The outside world, while still a factor, is not the sole factor.
The mind is, according to Freud, hardly a blank slate. The comparison of Romanticism to modernism can be equated with the debate of nature to nurture.
Carl Jung, another psychologist, incorporated Freud's unconscious mind theory with his own belief in natural essence. This combination of ideas created a new term, the collective unconscious. This is the idea that all human beings share a series of archetypes born into them. Jung used this series of predisposed notions to attack the idea that breaking social norms was to be considered immature or ignorant. He argued instead that this breach of traditional societal law was a normal inclination of the human mind. This theory was an excellently timed precursor to the modern culture, in which freedom of expression and interpretation was considered progress, and anything traditional was simply backpedaling.
Composers and musicians took the make it new calling and applied it to their own field by experimenting with new expressive modes of music. This newfound freedom began as atonality. Atonality was essentially forming songs which lacked a tonal center or a key. Because of this, there was more unpredictability and bizarreness, as dissonance became an accepted element in music. Atonality sounded something like this.
This experimentation was thought to evoke new interpretations and emotions in its audience. Music like this introduced new aesthetic techniques and modes of expression. Soon atonality was surpassed by Surrealism, in which a phrase in the music is repeated with various twists. For example, this phrase might be used. And then come back in another form, such as retrograde, which is reversing the order of the notes. Or inversion, in which the notes are flipped across an axis on the staff. This process would create a sort of mirror image of the music. Further, retrograde inversion combines these two techniques and plays a flipped phrase of the music in reverse order. This process created some bizarre sounds. Later, a subset within Serialism was invented, called the 12-tone system. This was very similar to Surrealism, the only difference being that every note in the chromatic scale of an octave must be used once in the phrase. It seems that these parameters eliminate even the slightest possibility of creating beautiful music.
And now, a moment of dissonance, brought to you by the Modern Modernist Association.
Nervous from the newfound power of innovation displayed in the war, the modernist movement took a break from technology and strived to find a better world through art and design. H.G. Wells understood the power of this technology and how it could either perfect or destroy the world.
Never before have the conditions of life changed so swiftly and enormously as they have in the last 50 years. We have been carried along, and we are only now beginning to realize the force and strength of the storm of change that has come upon us.
Not only the new technology, but also the idea of a mechanistic mental process came with the invention of factories and the ideas of efficiency. The war also moved these mechanistic mindsets along, and as we know, modernists strove to back away from the war. Machine culture is the idea that technology begins to control both the human body and the human mind. This is a fear displayed in many novels, and perhaps even the world today. Anyways, the technology which concludes modernism, the atom bomb, is a type of development which modernists were afraid of all along, and explains the fear of innovation during that era.
Postmodernism rose as reaction to the failure of modernism. Modern science, despite its major accomplishments, failed to meet man's vision of the ideal society. By the end of World War II, the collective faith in the idea of progress had largely vanished.
Today, we encounter complications as a result of the very technology that was supposed to fix the pre-existing complications. With the onset of postmodernism, optimism and hope for the future has been replaced with meaninglessness and fear of our own abilities.
Essentially, postmodernism replaced modernism without making the situation any better. Postmodern thinking made us fear ourselves. We look back at our past, back to modernism and before, and critique all of our mistakes. But at the time, we didn't know that the creation of those technologies, the rush to progress, and so many other modernist values were mistakes at all.
Postmodernism rejects all universal systems or ways of explaining reality. The scientific revolution and Enlightenment made people lose faith in God as explanation of why this world is the way it is. But now, having lost faith even in science as a reliable source, the public perceives all truth as subjective and very relative. Nothing is absolute. We have no reliable sources to explain the principles of existence.
As for the arts, we have the modernist separation of culture into high and low art forms, continuing into postmodernism. The highbrow culture consists of paintings, sculpture, stage plays, classical music, poetry, and literature. When looking at these arts, there is an extension off of the flourish of abstractness that came with modernism. In literature, there is now little to no distinguishing line between the way we speak and the way we write. Even in poetry, there exists only a very slender divider between common language and what used to be a beautiful form of communication. A prerequisite of understanding highbrow culture is an advanced education which puts a large portion of the world out of reach of the highbrow arts. The lowbrow culture is comprised of arts concerning entertainment, television, soap operas, movies, popular music, commercial art. We live in an age of images and information, and with the innovation of the internet, access to this low culture has become easier than ever. Thus, the low art that arose during the modernist period has overwhelmed our postmodern lives. Modernism, and its perpetual cry to make it new, shaped the postmodern domain we now inhabit. As we live day to day in this world, fundamentally altered by technology and convenience, we can see in every action the impact of the modern period. And as postmodernists, many of us live this life tentatively, fearful of the power we now know we hold, the power to create, the power to destroy. We ask ourselves, where are we going? Where are we headed? How do we progress now, knowing what we know about the world, about ourselves? These are the questions. We have yet to uncover the answers. And thus, while we exist in a time defined as postmodern, a modernist principle peeks through the cracks in our philosophy. What are the true answers to these questions about our future? We cannot know. For truth is fluctuating, relative, and dynamic. The only course of action that remains for us is to live, simply live, and to cultivate our own version of the truth. A truth that will define us, define our lives, and define the future of our world.
It's gonna run until you do it.
One inch. Oh my gosh, we have 9 minutes. Leave.
Well,
Leave.